Hello and welcome to the PMG tutorial for building a workflow. In this exercise, you will get familiar with the Workflow Designer and create a simple workflow that can be used to onboard a new contractor. Let's get started. To create a workflow, navigate to your dashboard by clicking the link in the navigation near the top of the page. On the left-hand side, you will see a link to the Workflow Designer. Click the link. From the Workflow Designer screen, press the New Workflow button. You will need to provide a unique name for the workflow. When done, click the green Save button to view your new workflow. From the PMG Workflow Designer, you have a blank canvas to configure your business process. To begin, let's drag on a status action. From the left-hand side of the screen, filter for status, and then click and drag the status action onto the canvas. You can drag an output arrow from the start action to the status action by clicking and holding down the mouse. You will use these outputs to configure the path you want the workflow to take. To configure an action, select it and then set the action properties on the right-hand side of the screen. We'll start by updating the status text for this action. To do so, click on the edit icon next to the status label. From the configuration screen, you can add static text as well as dynamic values by referencing workflow variables. To do so, click on the Workflow Data button and filter for the variable of your choice. After you have finished, you can deploy your workflow for use by clicking on the Deploy drop-down in the top navigation and selecting Deploy New Version. Now the workflow is ready for use and can be kicked off by a form. Let's review what that looks like before we add anything else to this workflow. From your dashboard, you should see the form you previously created under the My Forms section. Select the form and click Edit if needed to access the Form Designer. Next, click the Design menu option and select Configuration. At the bottom of this page, you can select the workflow you have created from the drop-down. After you have done so, press the Deploy button to save your changes, and then press the View button to see your form in action. Now let's provide some demo data and submit the form to kick off the workflow. From the Summary screen, you can click the Process Details link to view the executing workflow. Now let's continue to build the workflow. Now that you have submitted the form, you can map the question values to the workflow by adding it to the list of linked forms. To do so, select the Start action and click on Linked Forms in the Action Properties. In the drop-down, search for the form you created and click Save and Close when done. You can now dynamically reference any values provided by the user in the workflow. Let's continue by adding a mandatory approval to the workflow. On the left-hand side, expand the Human Activities palette and drag out the approval action. First, you will need to provide a label and a display name. Now let's configure whom you need this approval to be assigned to by clicking the Assign Actors link. To assign the approval to a user, you need to set up a condition. For demo's sake, let us assign this to the submitter of the form by matching the approver's login to the submitter's. Alternatively, you can assign the approval to multiple users by using a more general condition. Lastly, let's configure the subject of the approval to provide some context for the approving user by selecting the subject property. Another way to quickly reference variables when editing an action property is by pressing Ctrl+space for a list of available variables. Next, drag on an email action by filtering for email on the left-hand side of the screen. Because the email action connects to an approval action, you can set it up to automatically send this notification to the assigned user. If at any point you want to submit your form with the latest updates made, you can deploy the workflow as new and resubmit the form. After the approval, let's configure the workflow to create a new user in Active Directory. To do so, filter for Create AD User and drag the action onto the canvas, or right-click and select Add to the Right to automatically add the action to the right of this selected action. Now let's configure the action properties. First, you need to provide a domain scenario. This allows you to manage multiple domains. For demo purposes, we have already created this for you. Select Domain from the variable dropdown. You will do the same for Parent Distinguished Name by selecting Distinguished Name. Then, we need to map in the information you collected on the form. For each property, click the Edit button and select the appropriate form variable, such as first name and last name. For display name, I will choose first name plus the last name. For UPN, select the email variable. For same account, let's use first name dot last name. Lastly, add a password in the password field. Typically you want to make this dynamic, but for demo's sake, let's keep it simple. The last action you need to include is the finish marker. This indicates that the workflow is complete. When you are done, click on Deploy New Version to submit your changes. Now let's go back to your form and submit it again. From the Process Details screen, you can see the process is waiting on an approval. You can complete this approval on the Summary screen by scrolling and clicking on the item under My Tasks. Approving the item will progress the workflow, and the action to create a new user in Active Directory will execute. You can track this from the Process Details screen. If successful, you will see the action exit out through the output labeled Success and continue to the finish marker. Congratulations, you have now created your first workflow.